Okay, so today we're going to look at why Rastafari even came about. The last section talked about that I did talked about the various streams, and for me that was completely unsatisfying. So today we're going to go into a deep dive to explain a bit of history as to why this actually came about, and this is really important. It's important stuff. So let's get to it. Formation under pressure, colonial Jamaica, scripture, Ethiopia, and the moral conditions that made Rastafari possible. If you want to understand how Rastafari begins, you cannot start with a coronation, a preacher, or a set of beliefs. You have to start with pressure. Movements of this kind do not emerge because someone has had an idea. They emerge because of the way of living becomes morally unbearable. Because the way living becomes morally unbearable, and people are forced to look for a different orientation to reality. Early 20th century Jamaica was a society still living inside a long architecture of slavery. Emancipation had ended legal ownership, but it had not undone the structures that slavery built. Land remained concentrated, labor remained cheap and expendable, education was limited, authority was inherited rather than earned, and the social hierarchy that slavery had normalized continued to organize daily life even after the chains were gone. This matters because systems do not simply disappear when the law changes. They embed themselves in habits, expectations, and forms of speech. Can't, a society can declare freedom and can still communicate in 1,000 small ways who is expected to command and who is expected to comply. Jamaica in this period was governed by British colonial rule, and that rule carried a particular moral tone. It presented itself as civilized, ordered, and Christian. Law and administration were framed as instruments of progress, yet for the majority of the black population, these same instruments functioned as mechanisms of control. Authority arrived impersonally, backed by force, and insulated from accountability. Decisions were made elsewhere. Obedience was assumed rather than negotiated. See what's happening here? This created a deep moral contradiction. The language of righteousness was everywhere, but its fruits were difficult to see. Christianity was publicly honored, but often privately experienced as something that justified the existing order rather than challenged it. The Bible was presented, preached, sung, and read, yet its moral force was frequently filtered through colonial interest. And still, the Bible still mattered. This is one of the most important things to understand. Rastafari does not emerge in a context where scripture is foreign or marginal. It emerged in a society saturated with biblical language and imagery. The people who would later reason their way into Rastafari were already shaped by scripture. They knew its stories, they knew its promises, they knew its claims about dignity, inheritance, judgment, and deliverance. That saturation is crucial because it means the moral tension was not between Christianity and something else. It was between the Bible as read by the people and the Bible as deployed by the system. When a text that speaks of liberation, justice, and divine authority is repeatedly used to sanctify inequality, it does not lose power, it becomes volatile. It invites reinterpretation, kind of demands it. It invites resistance from within. Alongside this biblical saturation, there was another current movement through the Caribbean imagination, a growing awareness of Africa as something more than a lost past. For generations, Africa had been spoken of primarily as absence, the place where people were taken from and stripped of all meaning, reduced to an origin story without dignity. But scripture itself complicates that story. You see, Africa appears in the Bible not as a void, but as a participant in sacred history. Ethiopia is named, Kush is named, Africa is not written out of the text. For a people already living inside scripture, this mattered deeply. Out of this recognition grows what is often called Ethiopianism, not yet Rastafari, but a way of reading the Bible that refuses to accept that sacred history belongs exclusively to Europe. Ethiopianism affirmed that black people are not latecomers to the story of God, nor outsiders borrowing someone else's inheritance. Africa is present in the text. Africa has standing. This is not a political program, it is a moral correction. It reorients the imagination. It undermines the colonial suggestion that civilization and divine favor flow in one direction only. So by the early 20th century, several pressures are already converging. A people living under inherited inequality, a Bible that promises dignity but is often mediated through power, a growing recognition that Africa is not absent from sacred history, and an increasing sense that the story being lived does not account for the reality being experienced. What has not yet arrived as is a language of dignity strong enough to carry these tensions into public consciousness. That language comes through Garveyism. Before Garvey, many black Jamaicans lived with a sense of quiet contradiction. They knew something was wrong, but lacked the framework to articulate it without shame. Garveyism does not begin by offering theology, it begins by offering recognition. It names dignity as something that exists prior to permission. It insists that black identity is not a deviation from history, but part of it. This shift is decisive. Once dignity is named, interpretation changes. The Bible is read differently, history is read differently, authority is evaluated rather than assumed. Garveyism teaches people to expect that African leadership could matter, that African sovereignty could carry meaning, that black kingship need not be dismissed as primitive or symbolic of only the past. It does not tell people what to believe about God. It trains them to see themselves as people whose lives and histories are capable of bearing significance. This training of the imagination is what everything that follows is what makes everything that follows intelligible. At this stage, nothing called Rastafari yet exists. There is no unified doctrine, no settled movement. What exists is readiness. A people have been prepared to recognize significance when it appears and to question authority when it demands loyalty without legitimacy. It is important to pause here and to name what is actually happening analytically, because this pattern will repeat later. What is forming is not a system, but a posture, a way of seeing power, dignity, and history that doesn't depend on administrative control. The people involved are not being trained to design institutions. They are being trained to refuse lies. This is so important. That distinction matters. Movements that begin with institution building tend to measure success in terms of control and scale. Movements that begin with refusal to measure success uh, in terms of moral clarity and survival. That's what they are. Rastafari will belong to the second category. That posture is already present before any coronation, before any preacher, before any community is built. The ground has already been prepared. So, when an event arrives that crystallizes these pressures, when recognition becomes unavoidable, it does not create something new from nothing, it activates something that has already been forming under pressure. And this is where we will go next. Garveyism, coronation, and the moment recognition becomes unavoidable. By the time Garveyism had done its work, something crucial had shifted in the public imagination. People have not been given answers, but they have been given permission to interpret reality without waiting for validation from the colonial order. That permission is dangerous to any system that depends on unquestioned authority. What Garveyism does, more than anything else, is relocate expectation. It trains people to expect that dignity can appear where it has been systematically denied. It teaches them that authority is not automatically legitimate simply because it is established, and it insists that history is not owned by those who currently benefit from it. This shift matters because it creates a population capable of recognition. Recognition is not belief, it's not agreement, it's an ability to notice something significant, the ability to notice significant without being told what to think about it. And once recognition is present, certain events can no longer be passed unnoticed. In 1930, Ras Tafari Makonnen is crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, taking the name Haile Selassie I. From the perspective of global politics, this is a ceremonial event of limited consequence. From the perspective of European empires, Ethiopia is a small, inconvenient exception, an African nation that has not been fully colonized, still asserting its sovereignty in a world increasingly organized by imperial power. But events do not land only according to the intentions of those who stage them. They land according to the readiness of those who witness them. For a people whose imagination has already been trained by Garveyism, the coronation does not appear neutral. It arrives charged not because it creates meaning, but because it confirms that meaning can exist where it has long been denied. Here is an African monarch, publicly crowned, bearing titles that resonate unmistakably with biblical language. Here is a figure who does not appear as a relic of the past, but as a living presence in the modern world. And here is that presence acknowledged, however reluctantly, by global powers. This is not fantasy, it's visibility. The coronation does not tell people what to believe, but it makes it impossible to continue pretending that African sovereignty is irrelevant or that black leadership cannot carry theological weight. At this point, it's essential to be precise. The coronation does not create Rastafari belief. It does not instantly generate doctrine. It does not compel uniform interpretation. What it does is force attention. Some see prophecy. Some see symbol. Some see political vindication with spiritual implications. Some see dignity made public. But almost no one has been shaped by Garveyism. But almost no one who has been shaped by Garveyism can see it as meaningless. This is the causal chain that is often missed. Garveyism prepares the imagination, the coronation activates recognition. Rastafari emerges in the space between those two movements. It's also important to notice what the coronation does not do. It does not resolve injustice. It does not dismantle colonial systems. It does not alter daily life in Jamaica. Power remains where it was. Authority continues to function as before. And this matters deeply because it prevents Rastafari from becoming triumphalist. The coronation does not deliver liberation. It delivers contradiction. It reveals that the world can acknowledge black sovereignty symbolically while continuing to enforce black subordination materially. That contradiction sharpens moral pressure rather than relieving it. At this point, something new begins to happen. The question is no longer simply whether dignity exists. It is whether the existing order has any moral right to demand loyalty from those it refuses to recognize fully. This is where preaching begins to change tone. Early Rastafari preachers were not primarily offering comfort. They were naming reality. They were asking whether the world as it is currently organized deserves the allegiance it assumes. They are interrogating the gap between what scripture says and what the system enforces. It is here that the language of Babylon begins to take shape, not as a fixed concept, but as an emerging diagnosis. Babylon is not first identified as a specific government, it's identified as a way of organizing power that claims righteousness while producing degradation. This is also an important analytical point that needs to be made. What is emerging is not a program for reform, it's a judgment about legitimacy, not efficiency. Rastafari is not asking how to make the system work better. It's not asking whether the system has a right to define what it's asking whether the system has a right to define what better even means. This distinction will remain central. Once legitimacy is questioned, administration loses its moral cover. Rules can still be enforced, laws can still be applied, but obedience becomes morally contingent rather than automatic. This is a dangerous position for any system, and the system responds accordingly. The colonial authorities do not initially treat Rastafari preaching as a political threat. It appears fragmented, inconsistent, lacking institutional ambition. There is no clear leadership hierarchy, no political agenda, no policy agenda, no attempt to seize power. But the appearance is misleading. What Rastafari threatens is not control, but consent. By refusing to grant moral ultimacy to the existing order, it undermines the psychological foundations on which the order represents. A system cannot tolerate dissent. A system can tolerate dissent longer than it can tolerate withdrawal of legitimacy. This helps explains why the response to Rastafari becomes increasingly severe, even as the movement remains organizationally loose. The threat is not takeover, the threat is refusal. At this point, individuals begin to emerge who give shape to what is still forming. Leonard Howell, Joseph Hibbert, Archibald Dunkley, and Robert Hines do not found Rastafari in the way modern institutions are founded. They do not agree on doctrine. They do not operate under a unified structure. What they share is a willingness to speak publicly what many are already reasoning privately. This contributes something different. Some emphasize theology, some emphasize symbolism, some emphasize community, some emphasize confrontation. This diversity is not a weakness at this stage. It reflects the fact that Rastafari is not yet a system. It is a field of pressure in which multiple resources are possible. What unifies these figures is not uniform belief, but a shared refusal to treat the existing order as morally final. And it is precisely because Rastafari does not immediately consolidate into a system that it proves difficult to suppress through conventional means. There is no single doctrine to ban, no institution to dissolve, no leader whose removal would end the movement. The system is used to dealing with opposition that wants to replace it. Rastafari does not play that game, does not seek recognition from Babylon. It does not petition for reform. It reasons, speaks, and lives differently. That brings us to a turning point. Up to this stage, Rastafari has been primarily interpretive. It has reread scripture, it has re-evaluated history, it has renamed authority. But interpretation alone cannot sustain a way of life indefinitely. The question that now emerges is whether this way of seeing can be embodied, whether it can organize daily life, whether refusal can become practice. That question will be tested in the most concrete possible way. And that test has a name. Embodiment, Pinnacle, and a refusal to become another system. When Leonard Howell establishes Pinnacle, something decisive happens. Rastafari moves from interpretation into embodiment. What has so far been a way of seeing now asks whether it can become a way of living. Pinnacle is not an experiment in administration. It is not a utopian blueprint. It's a test of coherence. Can a people who have withdrawn moral consent from Babylon organize life without reproducing Babylon's logic? The settlement itself is modest. Land is worked collectively. Life is simple. Authority is informal. There is no attempt to replicate the structure of the colonial state. No bureaucracy, no hierarchy that mirrors the system outside it. The aim is not to prove superiority, but to live without dependence. And that matters because dependence is one of Babylon's most reliable tools. Systems that dominate do not only coerce, they train people to rely on them for survival, legitimacy, and order. Pinnacle represents a refusal of that dependency. Work is not merely economic, it is moral. Community is not merely social, it is formative. Separation is not escapism, it's protection. At Pinnacle, Rastafari is not attempting to build a rival state, it's attempting to step out of a story it no longer accepts. This is where critical analysis insight becomes unavoidable. Rastafari's resistance to system building is not an absence of ambition, it is an intentional refusal to make administration the carrier of moral hope. Pinnacle does not seek to scale, does not seek recognition, does not seek permanence through institution, it seeks coherence. The question Pinnacle asks is not, can we govern better? It is, can we live truthfully without becoming what we reject? Which is fair enough. It's a good question. That question is far more difficult though. For a time, Pinnacle functions, not perfectly, not without tension, but meaningfully. It demonstrates that an alternative mode of life is possible, one that does not depend on the colonial system for its identity or justification. And this is precisely why it cannot be tolerated. The response from the authorities is not confrontation, is not confusion, but force. Pinnacle is raided, land is seized, Howell is arrested repeatedly, the community is dismantled. It is important to be clear about why this happens. Pinnacle is not dangerous because it is violent. It is not dangerous because it seeks power. It is dangerous because it withdraws consent. A system can tolerate dissent that remains rhetorical. It struggles to tolerate withdrawal that becomes practical. When people demonstrate that life can be organized without reliance on the dominant order, the moral claim of that order is exposed. Pinnacle threatens Babylon not by attacking it, but by making it unnecessary. This is a crucial moment of learning, and it shapes Rastafari profoundly. The destruction of Pinnacle teaches that Zion cannot be secured through space alone. Physical separation is insufficient protection. Any attempts to embody an alternative life will be met with force if it undermines dependency structures. This does not lead Rastafari to abandon its vision, it leads it to deepen it. Instead of pursuing new settlements, the emphasis shifts inward. Zion becomes less about geography and more about orientation. Separation becomes moral rather than spatial. Discipline becomes personal rather than institutional. This is not retreat, it's adaptation. Here we need to pause and name something carefully. Pinnacle shows that Rastafari understands something many movements learn too late. Systems respond most aggressively not to critique, but to viable alternatives. Once refusal becomes lived, power reveals its limits of tolerance. The lesson Rastafari draws is not that embodiment was a mistake, it's that embodiment cannot depend on permanence, scale, or institutional security. This is why Rastafari does not attempt to rebuild Pinnacle elsewhere in the same form, not because it lacked courage, but because it learned what that path invites. At this point, another analytical tension becomes visible. By refusing to become administrative, Rastafari protects itself from corruption through power. It avoids the slow transformation of moral vision into enforcement mechanisms. It remains difficult to co-opt, difficult to centralize, difficult to instrumentalize. But this refusal also sets a boundary on which it can do. Without formal structures, authority becomes relational and informal. Elders emerge through recognition rather than appointment. Influence flows through reputation, consistency, and perceived spiritual depth. This has strengths. Authority remains visible, power stays personal, hypocrisy harder to hide. But it also has limits. Informal authority can be uneven, it can drift, it can become opaque. Without agreed mechanisms for adjudication, conflict resolution depends heavily on character. conflict resolution depends heavily on character rather than structure. Rastafari seems to accept this trade-off deliberately. It chooses the risk of inconsistency over the certainty of domination. It chooses moral exposure over bureaucratic insulation. It chooses limitation over total control. This choice cannot be understood apart from history. People who have experienced administration primarily as discipline rather than service are unlikely to trust systems to remain benevolent. So instead of attempting to constrain power through design, Rastafari constrains power by refusing to house it in structures that claim final authority. This is where the off-remarked seriousness of the movement begins to make sense. When you do not believe systems can save you, discipline must do the work systems usually perform. Identity must be guarded. Language must be chosen carefully. Practices must be intentional, otherwise the surrounding order will reshape you by default. Pinnacle's destruction, therefore, does not end Rastafari, it clarifies it. The movement does not collapse because it was never dependent on territory. It was dependent on orientation. Once that orientation is secured inwardly, it becomes portable. It survives dispersion. It adapts to pressure. From this point onwards, Rastafari spreads not by expansion, but by endurance. This is not how modern movements are trained to think. Success is usually measured in numbers, influence, and institutional presence. Rastafari measures success differently, by whether it can remain itself under pressure. That measure explains both its resilience, its refusal to promise solutions, and it can't sustain. Its refusal to promise solutions it can't sustain. Pinnacle answers one question decisively. Yes, an alternative way of life can be embodied, but no, it cannot be made safe through systems. That insight will echo through everything that follows. Suppression, survival, limits, and the wisdom of unresolved tension. After Pinnacle, the pattern becomes clear. Rastafari is not suppressed because it is confused, but because it is coherent enough to persist. Even it does not fade when confronted. It does not collapse when dismantled. It does not require institutional shelter to survive. Instead, it adapts. Suppression does not eliminate Rastafari, it disperses it. The movement spreads outwards, not through organized expansion, but through people who carry the orientation with them. Rastafari becomes something that can be lived anywhere because it's no longer tied to a place, structure, or formal leadership. This dispersal reinforces the already developing instinct. Survival depends on inward clarity rather than outward control. From this point onward, Rastafari does not seek safety through consolidation. It does not attempt to negotiate legitimacy with Babylon. It does not pursue recognition as a movement in the modern sense. It remains loosely organized, internally serious, and resistant to capture. This has consequences, both strengths and limits. On one hand, the movement becomes remarkably durable. Without central leadership, it cannot easily be dismantled. Without formal doctrine, it resists rigid definition. Without administrative ambition, it avoids the internal corruption that often follows success. Rastafari survives precisely because it refuses to become efficient. On the other hand, this same refusal limits what the movement can do. It does not produce a unified response to injustice. It does not scale solutions. It does not offer mechanisms for coordinating beyond the local and relational. These limits are not accidental, they are chosen. At this stage, it becomes possible to name the deeper wisdom and the deeper attentions together. Rastafari has learned through experience that power does not does not merely corrupt by excess, it corrupts by abstraction. When authority detaches from personhood, responsibility things, when systems claim moral legitimacy simply because they function, obedience becomes compulsory rather than meaningful. So, Rastafari responds by keeping authority close to the body, close to the community, close to daily life. It refuses to house moral hope in structures that cannot be held accountable face to face. This refusal is not ideological, it is empirical. For people whose recent history includes slavery, plantation discipline, and colonial administration, power has almost always arrived as something done to them, not something negotiated with them. The idea that authority might be made safe through design alone is therefore not persuasive. So, Rastafari does not attempt to perfect power, it attempts to limit its reach. It places restraint ahead of control, discipline ahead of enforcement, separation ahead of domination. That posture explains why Rastafari cannot die. That posture explains why Rastafari can diagnose systemic injustice with clarity, yet decline to propose administrative alternatives. It does not believe that injustice persists because of poor design alone. It believes injustice persists because systems eventually serve themselves. This belief is not a theory. It's a conclusion drawn from lived experience, and yet the limits of this posture are real. Power does not disappear simply because it is distrusted. It reappears wherever people live together. Authority emerges informally, influence concentrates, decisions are made, whether acknowledged or not. Rastafari's refusal to formalize authority protects it from certain kinds of corruption, but it does not eliminate the need for judgment, coordination, or conflict resolution. These functions still occur, often through personal influence rather than recognized structures. The movement seems to accept this risk and prefers uneven authority to totalizing authority. It prefers visible inconsistency to invisible domination. This choice does not resolve the problem of power, it names its danger and limits its ambition. That may not be sufficient for every context, but it is honest. This honesty is one of Rastafari's most underappreciated qualities. Many movements promise what they cannot sustain. They claim that justice can be engineered, that power can be purified, that systems can be made righteous through better intentions. Rastafari refuses that promise. It does not offer a final solution, it offers a posture. That posture insists that dignity must be defended daily, not assumed, that authority must remain morally accountable or be refused, that identity must be guarded or it will be overwritten, that survival under pressure requires discipline, seriousness, and restraint. These are not abstract principles, they are survival strategies refined over time. Rastafari endures not because it has resolved every tension, but because it has refused to lie about them. It lives with unresolved questions rather than rushing towards false closure. It accepts limits rather than masking them with ambition. It holds Zion as an orientation rather than a program. That refusal to resolve everything is not weakness, it is integrity. So, this chapter does not end with an answer, it ends with a standing tension. Rastafari teaches us that it is possible to see systems clearly without believing they can save us. It teaches us that dignity can be practiced without waiting for permission. It teaches us that survival sometimes depends on refusal rather than conquest. And it also leaves open a question it, it does not attempt to answer fully. If power is avoidable, but dangerous, what kind of authority, if any, can be trusted to rule without becoming Babylon? Rastafari does not resolve that question. it lives beneath it. And that is where its seriousness lies. Okay, thank you very much for listening to chapter 2. I hope you found it as interesting as I have. I feel that it's a real diagnosis. It's a real diagnosis tool which is really underappreciated and really not understood about why Rastafari even existed, and yeah, and I just really hope that that's really useful to everybody, to Rastafari. Hopefully, if you're watching this, to just people that are really interested. I think there are probably many Rastafari that are watching this and don't know some of this history themselves. I can well imagine, and I hope you feel that you've got something out of it. I also think that it's really important, when others talk with Rastafari as well, that it's that knowing this history, knowing this background, that it is essentially it's a liberation movement, and why and what that means, and that it can be a liberation movement that is anti-colonial yet not nationalistic as these things tend to be. What that means, I think that having that at least in your mind when you talk, when you have communication, when you have conversations, I think is a great starting place. Is a great place to be. All right, thank you very much, and thank you very much for being on this journey with me as well. Okay, see you in chapter 3.